Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragon's Jewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan. And I'm just going to get all those wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below. And if you like the content, please make sure you're hitting the like button on the videos. And of course, if you want to share some love down in the comments below, it's always greatly appreciated. And I absolutely love reading them. I do my best to make sure that I respond back and share some love in your direction as well, because naturally without you, this channel wouldn't exist. And I appreciate each and every one of you. And I thought I would bring some of those Halloween spooky vibes to the channel. There are going to be in the WIP and Chat style format, but I'm going to read some ghost stories of Alberta, which is the province that I reside in. So I will have a spooky canvas that I'll be working on, and then I'm going to read a couple of ghost stories so that you can listen along while you dab and paint, or work on another craft, or what you normally do during WIP and Chats kind of thing, and I keep you company with some spooky tales from my province. So I figured that would be fun. The Dunvegan Rectory. There are many theories that attempt to explain what a ghost is or why a place might be haunted. Some say that a ghost is a psychic imprint left behind by the energy of the deceased. Others feel the phenomenon emanates from the subconscious of the individual who's experienced it. At least one parapsychologist is convinced that most hauntings can be explained by the theory of retrocognition, which reports that people encountering a ghost have become temporarily displaced from their usual place and time. While it is difficult to believe that any single theory, no matter how ambitious, could hope to explain every ghostly encounter, the story of Dunvegan Rectory appears to strongly support retrocognition as a possible explanation. Perhaps this case even requires retrocognition to explain the otherwise unexplainable. The following events took place during July 1992 at the Dunvegan Historic Site in northwestern Alberta. On the shores of the majestic Peace River, the site was a Catholic mission and fur trading center during the 1800s. Now, a picturesque spot, this place has been restored to reflect those early days. A visit to Dunvegan offers a unique opportunity to step back in time and explore life as it was when the church and the Ort buildings were new. At least two visitors, mother and daughter, Gail and Janice Moon, unwittingly took that opportunity literally and experienced an exhausting and disorienting period of apparent retrocognition. The family's plan for the day hadn't included a trip to the rectory. As a matter of fact, Gail and her husband Neil, along with Janice and her daughter Kelsey, had already enjoyed a full family day picking strawberries. They were all thirsty after the berry picking, however knew that they could find a drinking fountains at the site. They arrived at the Dunvegan buildings around 8 p.m. on July 11th, 1992. We really had no intention of looking at the site, as we were just having a drink and planning on leaving. We had no idea that day was the grand opening for the restored site. We heard the bells ring and saw two interpreters in period costumes walking toward the back of the rectory. Mom and I just continued walking towards the site, with Dad and Kelsey following. In her quest to satisfy her thirst, Janice was blissfully unaware that she was about to embark on the experience of a lifetime. As her parents went into the church, Janice took her daughter's hand and walked to a statue of a woman that had caught her eye. It was stark, no plaque or inscription. I immediately felt shivers, walked around her 2 or 3 times looking for identification, and felt frustrated there was none. I kept looking at her face, but was afraid to touch her. Finally, with a great force of will, Janice reached out and touched the stone-cold hem of the figure's robe. The uncomfortable feelings increased. I had completely forgotten about Kelsey, even though she was still with me. Just then, Janice's mother came back out of the church. Although they didn't know it at the time, both mother and daughter were experiencing equally bizarre reactions to the religious icons around them. Mom felt overwhelmed by the paintings in the church. She came out and walked over to us. Mom looked at the statue and said, "Where did she come from?" Mom was positive she had never seen her before, even though she had been to Dunvegan several times over the years. Like her daughter, Gail felt hesitant to touch the statue. To her, the inanimate object had taken on ominous qualities. The statue was eerie, bordering on being very threatening. I couldn't look at her eyes, I couldn't look at her face. I had visited the site many times, and I had never seen the statue before, although Neil has informed me that the statue has been there for years. As Janice had, Gail eventually brought herself to touch the statue, but even as she did, Gail wondered at the marble it had been made from, for the stone seemed luminous. Moments later, the 3 generations of women walked away from the sculpture, but the strange sensations Janice and Gail were experiencing weren't that easy to leave behind. We walked past the church. I stopped and looked at a dark-haired interpreter who was standing inside the church door. She recently wasn't aware of it then, but the sensitive Janice was no longer perceiving her surroundings as the other people around her were. He was no longer in costume, but in gray dress pants with black flecks. I felt he was dressed wrong for who he really was. Gail's thoughts were equally as odd. She had noticed the interpreter earlier and thought, "He knows, and he's a real part of this history." Both Janice's and Gail's processes were beginning to reflect their shift in chronological perspective from present to past. Their immediate surroundings were becoming vague and distant. 2 sight interpreters in period costume passed the women and spoke to them. I heard them, but they seemed very far away. I was not aware of Kelsey, other people, or noises. The little group made their way into the rectory. Gail walked over to the altar. Janice reported that her mother had a very strong feeling that she was in someone's home, that they weren't there, and that she had no business being there, that she was imposing. The woman's perception of reality was now altering from present to past. Gail's feelings were intensified when she saw the altar. There was something wrong with the green cloth on the altar. It was too much green. There was no white cloth over the green cloth. She also felt that the candlesticks on the altar were out of place. While Janice was bothered by the same objects as her mother was, the younger woman's sensations had by this time become psychological. I felt a strong sense of tingling through my body. I had a strong feeling of someone there. I made a comment about too much green cloth. I looked at the candlesticks, which were all lined up against the far shelf of the altar, and knew that they were wrong. We turned around and both walked into the back bedroom under the stairs. They found out later that this room was known as the priest's room. Gail remarked how she saw the bed, the wardrobe against the wall, and the clothes hanging on a wooden clothes hanger with hooks. More than just Gail's sense of sight was becoming involved, though. She reported that she had smelled a warm body smell, as if someone had just gotten out of bed. The feeling of intruding on someone's personal space was increasing. Mom felt really uncomfortable and intrusive. Not threatened, but just that she was somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. The effect on Janice, normally down to earth, was even more dramatic. The present had all but slipped away. From the doorway, I looked at the clothes and said to myself with relief, thank God he hung them up properly. I knew in my heart that someone had just taken those clothes off. I then turned toward the bed, having no idea where Mum was in the room. I had the sense that someone was in bed. The bed was protected by a surround of mosquito netting that Janice felt drawn to touch. As she did, a near panic overtook her. I became overwhelmed with a strong tingling sensation throughout my whole body. I said, "Get me out of here." Mom heard me and followed me out of the room, as I left immediately. After returning briefly to the altar and once again being bothered by the solid green cloth, Janice made her way into another bedroom in the rectory. I glanced in, not paying attention to what I saw, turned around and saw Kelsey. I asked her if she wanted to go upstairs, and she said, "Yes, do you?" Janice agreed to go with her daughter, but noted that my mom could not bring herself to go upstairs as she felt this was private and she'd had enough. Janice herself felt almost equally uncomfortable about going upstairs, but she had told Kelsey she would accompany her. When she looked up the stairs, she could see that other people were visiting the area, and she felt somewhat foolish about her concerns a moment earlier. Janice and Kelsey made their way up the stairs, and for a few minutes anyway, into a more comfortable part of Janice's trip through time. She recalled that the staircase was narrow, but the steps were not worn. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I felt totally at ease and peaceful. All apprehension was gone. At the top of the stairs, the pair turned right, and Janice informed her daughter that this was the trapper's room. Here the strange sensations continued, but at least now they were pleasant and easy to cope with. I became excited when I saw the window to the right of the door. I opened it, explaining to Kelsey how it opened. It was very easy to open. The window felt cool and smooth. I looked outside for an instant, and it was quiet outside. I saw nothing. I lost Kelsey's presence, but knew she was there. We walked into the room across the hall. I told Kelsey this was the students' room. Those recent pleasant feelings were instantly replaced by intensely unpleasant ones. For now, even her personal identity was becoming caught up in the time warp. I was instantly angry and said to myself, "You work so hard and there isn't even a net over your bed." I was still talking to Kelsey, but when we left this room, I lost her completely. We walked across the empty hall area and into the far corner bedroom. At the doorway, I saw the desk in front of the window. I turned to the desk, and sitting on it was the bottom half of an oil lamp, then the top half of the oil lamp, then the clear glass inkwell with a solid blue smooth wooden pen with the black tip resting in the inkwell. I was very calm and totally absorbed within myself, not hearing or seeing anyone. I touched the bottom half of the lamp and then the top half. I picked up the pen with my left and held it up by my shoulder. My arm bent. That simple movement caused the apparition to appear. Immediately, I was standing directly behind a man, a priest with his hat and jacket on. He was sitting at the desk, writing with the blue pen with his right hand. The oil lamp was together and lit, sitting in the left corner of the desk. I looked at the window and saw it was dark outside. I looked back at the priest. He was still writing and sitting straight in his chair with only his head bent forward. I could see the top half of the pen and the top of one of his knuckles. Even though he had his hat on, I could see his beard on either side of his head. His beard was bushy, but soft to touch, and it was brown with a reddish tinge to it. I felt that it was right that I was there. I belonged there, and it was so peaceful. I don't know how long I stood there with him, but eventually I realized what was happening. I shrieked or gasped and threw the pen. It landed back in its original place in the inkwell. From far away, I heard Kelsey say, "Mummy, do you think you broke the pen?" I said no, turned to see her, and she was gone. I was shaking. I looked up out of the window and saw daylight. I glanced around the room, feeling very shaken and scared, and knew I had to get out. I was spooked completely and felt that I was losing my mind. I started down the stairs as quickly as I could. At the bottom of the stairs, Gail was concerned as she watched her daughter hurrying down the steps. Janice had undergone reconstructive surgery to both knees, and for this reason normally walked downstairs slowly and carefully. Gail knew that something must be provoking Janice in order for her to be rushing on such a set of stairs. Like Janice, Gail could see that the steps were narrow, but the older woman could also see that they were badly enough worn to be worthy of at least a little extra care. Janice, however, was still experiencing retrocognition, viewing things as they had been more than 100 years ago. To her, the stairs were not hazardously worn, but new and even. Halfway down the stairs, I became aware of other people walking around. I panicked as I wanted Kelsey and I out of the rectory now. We walked away from the rectory and sat down on a bench. I was very quiet and watched everyone else to see if they were normal. They walked by laughing and talking, commenting that even though she was now outside, she was feeling tremendously shaken and disoriented. Without looking at Mom, I said, "I saw a man upstairs." I saw a priest writing at the desk upstairs. Mom was not surprised, and that made me feel okay. Slowly, Janice's mental and emotional states returned to normal. Because Gail's feeling of intruding on someone's privacy had prevented her from going upstairs, her readjustment to here and now came somewhat more quickly. Even so, the two women were badly shaken and stayed up until the wee hours of the morning, discussing their experiences. Both of them realized that no matter how much talking they did, they would have to return to the restored buildings at Dunvegan in order to properly assess their ordeal. In the meantime, Janice tried to sort out her experiences in her mind. I was willing to admit that I'd seen a ghost, but I was just befuddled and emotionally distraught when I realized that what I'd seen on the 11th of July isn't really what you see when you go in there. Unfortunately, that contradiction was going to be a fact she would also have to come to grips with. The family returned to the missions building on July 19th. We started at the statue again, and I was sorely disappointed because the stone did not look the same. It had lost its luster. It was just stone. Next, they made their way back to the rectory. Peter, the interpreter, assigned to the house that day, was busy with other visitors, and so Gail and Janice began to look about on their own. I think we unnerved Peter a bit because we looked at each other and said, "It's changed, it's been changed." They were sure the quilt on the bed in the priest's rooms was different than it had been on the previous visit.
Janice became very agitated because the hat that she thought should be on the rack in that room wasn't there. She also noted a red trunk or chest on the floor and commented, "That wasn't there on the 11th, or I would have fallen over it." Gail remarked that an oil lamp she knew she'd seen on a wall was not only gone, but there was no trace of it ever having been. There was no mark on the wall where it would have been, nor any stains from the smoke or soot. When they went upstairs, both Gail and Janice felt that there had been even more changes. Janice tried to open the window as she had on her previous visit. It had been smooth and new and easy to open that day. Today it was old and very difficult to open. There were desks and bookcases in the central part of the second floor, which both women maintained hadn't been there when they visited only a few days before. It was in the visiting bishop's room that they noticed the greatest number of changes. They moved the bed, they moved the picture, they moved a lot of his stuff, and the net is gone, Janice informed her mother on their second visit. From the tone in her voice, it was clear that these differences were extremely bothersome to the younger woman. Gail realized that her daughter was really emotionally distraught over all of this, and that her voice was getting louder and louder. When she heard someone come up the stairs, she went to the head of the staircase to greet the person she hoped it would be, Peter. "I thought, this fellow will need some warning about what's happening. So I stopped him in the hallway and asked him some questions. How many spirits have you encountered in this place?" The interpreter was somewhat taken aback, but replied candidly, "Well, none as such, but we've had strange happenings. There have been times when we've closed the window on the north side of the central second floor, and later found it open. And other times we've opened the window and later found it closed. Sometimes we're downstairs and we hear footsteps upstairs." His reply gave Gail the opportunity she needed to give this young man some details of her family's decidedly unusual visit just a few days before. "We've come back today to look for answers," she concluded. Thus forewarned, Peter went with Gail to join Janice, who immediately accused the interpreter of moving things around at the site. With a surprised look, Peter replied that no, nothing had been moved here. Janice, of course, couldn't accept that, and she began to enumerate the changes. She informed me that not only had the bed been moved, but the mosquito netting that had hung around it on the 11th was now missing. "There's never been any netting around that bed," Peter assured. "There isn't even anything to hang it from." Gail countered by pointing to the ceiling beams all over where her daughter had insisted that the bed was located during July 11th. Sure enough, there were nail holes in a pattern from which, many years ago, mosquito netting could have hung. Janice's level of concern had escalated by now. Deeply upset by the differences she was observing, she handed her purse and camera to her mother and began to cry. Gail took 2 or 3 pictures and then left her daughter alone a while to settle down. When those photographs were developed, the women were in for a surprise of their lives. 2 snaps were taken just seconds apart, with barely any camera movement. The first one shows Janice rearranging artifacts to where she was sure they should have been placed. To take the second picture, her mother moved the camera only slightly to the right, but that frame captured a stark white form hovering behind Janice as she made the adjustments she felt necessary. You can see by that photo that he was right there with me. Peter suggested that they call Kelsey in to show them where she thought the bed had been on their last visit. The little girl joined them moments later and with great assuredness pointed to the area where her mother had said she'd seen the bed. She also described the netting, but then became nervous, uncomfortable, and uncommunicative. She'd had enough, her grandmother assessed. When the group went back downstairs, Janice noticed that a hat in the common room and called out, "There's the hat." The hat was on the rack in the bedroom. "No," Peter advised. "It's always been there." In the priest's room, both Gail and Janice remarked that the wardrobe was now missing, to which Peter replied, "There's never been a wardrobe in this room." There is now a white cloth covering the green cloth on the altar. On the 11th, both women had remarked that there was no contrasting color to break the solid green. Peter tried to explain that there was a set way to address the altar, and that it had looked exactly the same for many years. Janice asked to see any old photographs that might be at the site. She wanted to see if she could spot the priest that she had seen on her first visit. Peter brought some archival photos to her, but she was sure none of the men pictured in the shots showed the man she'd seen. When her mother suggested that she had perhaps seen someone other than a priest, Janice became very indignant. She knew who she'd seen. Now it was just a matter of finding a picture of him so that she could identify him. Peter was more than patient with Janice's challenges. "You don't work in a place like this without an open mind," he acknowledged. He then explained that he had a very ritualized procedure that he went through each night as he locked up. He called it putting the house to bed. All of Peter's co-workers knew how conscientious he was when he closed the house for the evening. For this reason, once a co-worker was surprised to see a light on in the visiting bishop's room, even though it was long past the time the house would normally be dark. He was quite a ways away when he saw it, but he drove over here to investigate. When he got to the rectory, he could see that there was no light on and that the curtains were closed. Janice and Gail were somewhat helped by their second visit, combined with Peter's stories. At least now they knew they weren't the only ones to have had strange experiences at Dunvegan. Still, that return trip wasn't quite enough, and the family returned for the third time on July 26th. By then, word of their bizarre trip through time had been spread, and so they were instantly recognized and welcomed when they returned. Both Gail and Janice spent a large part of the visit going over what they felt were the changes that they noted. The staff listened intently and surmised that perhaps the historians responsible for the site had unwittingly erred in recreating the rooms. The seriousness with which the historic site staff took Janice's assessment shocked her nearly as much as her trip back in time had. I was just amazed to be taken so seriously regarding the alterations that were made to Dunvegan based on her retrocognitive experience in the summer of 1992. This extraordinary ghost story has a very tender ending. A few months after visiting the site and having the incredible experience, Janice Moon was at home in Edmonton, asleep in bed, when she distinctively felt a kiss being placed on her cheek. I knew it was him, the priest that I'd seen on July 11th. He'd come to say goodbye. By informing the staff of the differences between what she saw while she was experiencing retrocognition and what she saw in the subsequent visits, Janice had helped the long-dead priest execute the changes he needed to make before he could be released from his earthbound haunt. Now at last, thanks to a successful communication with Janice, the unidentified priest was free to move on to his final reward. He whistles while he works. Some months ago, I was invited to spend a day doing readings and chatting with the students at 2 schools in a pretty little town in south central Alberta. In the morning, I arrived to a warm greeting at the high school. Before beginning the first session, I was invited to join the teachers for coffee in the staff room. Everyone was very friendly, and many people made a point to come over and chat with me. A few of them indicated that they might have an additional ghost story for me, right there in the school. The day was certainly starting out well. Sadly, those enticing leads were all I was able to come away with. No one, it seemed, really knew the story. Everyone had just heard that there was such a story. I decided that the high school ghost story was most likely little more than a legend created over the years by generations of students. Despite this disappointing realization, I spent a most enjoyable morning at the high school and found the students to be as welcoming as their teachers were. After lunch, I went on to the junior high school in town. Again, I was warmly received, and again I was given to understand that the school was haunted. Given the frustrations I had experienced trying to pin down this morning's potential ghost story, I decided not to let the possibility of a new lead distract me from reading to the students. I spent a delightful afternoon reading and talking to group after group of students. As I left, I was told the principal wanted to see me. It seemed he was well aware of the ghost story connected with his school. Not only had he felt and heard the spirit on several occasions, he even thought he caught a glimpse of the specter walking past the door of the school's office when he knew he was alone in the building. His encounters were nothing, though, he informed me, compared to those experienced by a member of the school's caretaking staff. I made a note to follow up on this enticing lead in the coming months. When I began to research for this book, I contacted the people associated with all the leads I collected over the years. Phoning that junior high school principal was one of the priorities on my agenda. Unfortunately, he didn't return my phone calls. I was, however, able to track down the custodian, Liz. She had quite a story to tell. She had worked at the school for nearly 20 years and indicated that she'd been aware of the presence pretty well since she started. The only thing I can really say is that often I hear keys and footsteps in the area downstairs by the staff room. Years back, when I was waxing the floors, I heard whistling. Not so unusual, you might think, except that Liz knew for a fact that when she heard the whistling, she was alone. She had locked herself in at the otherwise empty school. One other morning, I was just punched in the security code, and I heard coughing. She explained before assuring me that no one could have been in the school ahead of her without first turning off the alarm that she had just deactivated. Upon entering the school, she found it as empty as she had expected it would be. Despite it being empty, she remained convinced of what she heard. When you're by yourself in the school, you feel a presence. You feel someone's watching you. Nevertheless, I feel safe. It's friendly. It comes to the point where I don't even think much about it. Some time after the current principal took on his new school assignment there, he became suspicious that not everything was normal, so Liz was the one he approached with his concerns. Perhaps because she had been associated with the school for so long, he made the point to ask her one day, "Is there a ghost in the school?" Liz explained as best as she could about George, while acknowledging that she was absolutely no theories about who the spirit might actually be or why he hasn't left the school. By now, the junior high school ghost is so taken for granted that the caretaker and the principal tease each other about its existence. When something goes wrong, we say it's George, and sometimes the principal tells me that I'm George, she elaborated. And so George seems to be an unofficial but commonly accepted member of the junior high population. I spoke with the mother of one of the students who had actually seen George. My daughter said he was wearing a leather jacket when she saw him, the woman commented. She went on to explain that as George loves to play jokes on people around the school, she thinks he may be a former junior high student. The town's first junior high school was built on the same spot. The building that replaced it has since been renovated and added onto, but George's presence is felt, or heard, or seen only in the older section of the enlarged school. This restriction isn't surprising, as phantoms are usually only perceived in the area that existed when they were still flesh and blood. In order to try to confirm her suspicions, the woman has spent quite some time poring over old school yearbooks. She did find pictures of several former students named George, but as no one seems to know why the ghost has become known by that name, her search wasn't really that enlightening. However, anonymity doesn't seem to trouble George. He continues whistling and walking and rattling his keys happily into eternity.